Minister Hajdu, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Martin.
Let's start with, there's a lot to describe in this legislation. So first of all, who is it going to apply to?
The new proactive pay equity regime will apply to any federally regulated employees, and that would include public servants, but also people in the federal private sector, people that work for banks or telecommunications firms, for transportation companies, for grain elevators, and anyone that is subject to the federal labor code.
What about people who contract with the federal government? Who would be covered?
It actually does have a component that applies to federal contractors of $1 million or more.
Okay, so if I'm doing more than $1 million business a year with the federal government, I would then be covered by this as well?
You would be required to have a proactive pay equity regime.
The $1 million question is, what does this do?
So essentially what pay equity does is it compels employers to have a process to assess how they're compensating what would be typically called female-dominant positions compared to their male-dominant positions. It addresses the historical imbalance between how we value what's considered women's work. And the most simple way to describe it is to say, take an executive assistant and a mechanic. And maybe you have both of those people in your workforce. If the attributes of the job, the skill set of the job, the working conditions, etc., are the same for two positions, and yet the female job is paid dramatically less than the male position, that's where you see gender inequality. And it's really about how we're valuing the work that women typically do.
So this is work of equal value, equal pay for work of equal value.
Right.
This is then going to have to be assessed all the way through the federal pay chain. I mean, the entire federal government and all of those people you described. You're going to have a re-description or re-evaluation of all those job functions. How long is this going to take?
Well, we've given between 3 to 5 years, depending on the size of the organization, for employers to work with employee groups and to come up with a pay equity committee, for example, within their organization to ensure that there is that time to assess positions, the attributes of each position, and then determine if, in fact, compensation is due.
So federal departments, for example, will be getting back, what, to the head of the Treasury Board, Scott Bryson?
So the president of the Treasury Board would be the responsible person for the federal public service. And certainly through the federally regulated employers, there's the employer themselves would be responsible for having a regime within the time frame.
Mr. Bryson, in the press conference that you just had, he also described the fact that this would be done, for the most part, also in collaboration with unions. Unions would have to completely redraw all of their job descriptions as well.
Well, the unions have an important role to play in any pay equity discussion. In fact, I'm very fortunate to have gone through a pay equity process in the organization that I ran previous to politics. And it's important for those organizations that have a collective bargaining unit or units in some case, that they're working with the collective bargaining unit so that there isn't a dispute about how a particular job is assessed. In fact, unions will work with employers to develop the tools to do the assessment. So everybody understands and is in agreement about how they're going to rate various aspects of the position.
So this is a long way off. This probably then, you won't be seeing a lot of the concrete results of this until another government, until you are elected, or maybe not, until the next term of the government.
It's important that we start today. And I think what's really historic is that we're the first government to introduce proactive pay equity legislation. This is something that will address a long-standing issue, not just in the federal public service and in federally regulated private sector, but it is also an opportunity for us to show leadership. Quebec and Ontario already have proactive pay equity regimes, but no other provinces. And so it's important for us to take the lessons of Quebec and Ontario and move forward and ensure that women in federally regulated public and private sector have the same regime, so that they don't have to address inequity through a complaint system, but rather it's proactively done and maintained.
So once this is put into place, once you have an agreement on a requalification, recalibration of all these different job responsibilities and the value of those jobs, what kind of enforcement will you have? So once you've actually come to an agreement with the employers, with the unions, and you've reclassified all of these positions, what kind of enforcement will there be in terms of the equal pay?
So if at any time after the process is followed, or even during the process, there will be a pay equity commissioner that will be established, and that commissioner will be located with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and will have a suite of tools available to him or her to ensure that employers are following what they are regulated to do. They will also be able to take complaints, for example, from employer groups or employees who feel that their employer isn't conducting the pay equity process, but they'll also be able to provide orders to employers that are not compensating in the instance that an assessment of compensation is required.
So if, when this regime is in place, I am a woman and I find that my job is not being paid, equal value is not being paid properly, I'm not being paid appropriately, the Equity Commission would have powers to compel a change?
Right, and it depends on the workplace, but the woman would often be within a class of employees. So, for example, going back to our example, if the executive assistants in a particular organization feel that they've been misclassified or the employer hasn't acted in good faith, that class of employees could launch a complaint as well.
How many man-hours is this all going to take? It looks like a huge endeavor.
Well, I think it will take some time.
I should say man-hour, person hours.
It will take some person hours, that is for sure. But it will be a worthwhile endeavor, because what we know is that when women are fairly compensated, when they're equitably compensated for work of equal value, that it's not just good for women and their families and their outcomes, but it's also good for our economy. We know that if we can address gender equality in this economy, in our workplaces, that it's good for obviously the women, but it's fantastic for our economy as well.
When you arrive at these new, I'm wrestling with the terms, but when you arrive at these new pay classifications, the pay of equal value for equal pay for equal value, when you arrive at all of that system, is it going to apply equally in all those categories, in federally regulated employers, in the federal civil service, and in contractors who also work with the government? Is equally applied throughout all three of those categories?
Each employer will have their own pay equity regime. So an administrative assistant gets paid in company X would not be the same in company Y, and there's no intention that we would standardize that pay across various sectors or employers. It's really within an organization that we're curious to know, and where the inequity exists.
But the oversight and enforcement would be the same in all three categories?
The oversight and enforcement is with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal.
Okay. I wanted to ask you something else too. In the reporting, you have this new creation that's also come out of this, because what we saw today was the budget implementation bill, and these were all contained in the budget implementation bill, but there's also been a department named, and some people were reporting that department would then take care of this and implement these measures. That's a different department? That's
a different department. So the Status of Women Canada, which has been an agency up to this point, will become a full department with its own legislation and its own suite of tools to address gender equality writ large. But this pay equity regime will fall under the responsibility for enforcement and for any orders with first of all, the Ministry of Labour. My department will be providing tools and support and, of course, amending the code. But it will also be the responsibility of the Pay Equity Commissioner with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to address any problems going forward.
What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge? Is it the complexity? Is it the amount of time it's going to take? Is it a possible backlash?
Well, I think anything worthwhile takes time. I think that it is a complex process, but again, we won't be leaving employers to figure this out on their own. We will be providing them with support, with tools, with up to and including advice as they go forward. I think it's an opportunity for employers who haven't gone through this process to ensure that they do have equity in the workplace. It's one of the things that I found very reassuring was speaking to employers who already have a process like this that they voluntarily implemented, who say that it results in better employees that are more stably attached to the workforce, that feel that their work is being valued, there's less turnover, there's less, they have better returns on investment.
We've seen, for example, in Ontario, there was pay equity legislation, and a lot of it was clawed back when there was a change of government a few governments ago. Is this going to be an election issue? Is this going to be something you're going to say to Canadians, if you want pay equity in the federal civil service and connected industries, you're not going to get it if the other party comes in?
I think pay equity is a component of what we've been talking about, which is gender equality and the opportunity for women to fully participate and to have the full protections that men do in society and to have the same opportunity to succeed. And that is not just the right thing to do, that's the fiscally smart thing to do. When everybody has a fair chance at success, including women, that's when we see our economy really thrive. So we will be talking about our focus on gender equality as one that's critically important to Canada's economic success.
Why has it taken so long? some people would say that we're now less than a year, maybe just months away from the next election. Why is it taking so long to launch this now incredibly long and complicated process?
I think you said it yourself, that it is a very complex process, and we wanted to make sure that whatever we chose as a regime was going to be implementable, that employers would have an opportunity to weigh in on what would work and what wouldn't work in their own workplaces, that we listened to the advice of activists and advocates, but also of unions, and that we took information from the Bilson report, from the Special Committee on Pay Equity and both Ontario and Quebec to really put together a regime that would be fair, would result in equity, but also would be implementable. So those kinds of consultations take time, and to design a regime that will result in the outcome that you want takes time.
Okay, I have to ask you a last question, and this is probably more your colleague Scott Bryson, who is president of the Treasury Board, but obviously as someone who's overseeing the implementation of this. One of the things that looms large in this town and across the country, and for all federal civil servants, public servants, is the Phoenix pay system. And right now you have a system where people are not even getting paid. Is this a particularly difficult time to implement these kind of big changes, which are going to take a lot of government effort, a lot of union effort, but at the same time you have a pay system that's not even paying a lot of people?
What I would say is women have waited too long for equity, and that delaying a process such as pay equity because of the challenges with Phoenix would be historically repeating the essentially the inequity that's happened over years. And so I think it's important that we continue to dedicate our resources to Phoenix. It's unacceptable that employees are not getting paid for the work that they perform, and we will continue that hard work. But we will not stop in terms of our agenda of ensuring that there's equal pay for work of equal value.
Okay, well, Minister Hajdu, I thank you very much for coming in. We will watch this process with a lot of interest. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Martin.